I was in Lisbon when a developer erased part of my farm like I'd already died. Not damaged, not clipped by a machine, not mistakenly disturbed the way people say when they want you to swallow a lie. My water tower was gone. One minute I was finishing a dull consulting meeting, and the next I was staring at a photo from home that looked like somebody had ripped the spine out of my irrigation system. My place sits outside a small town in Northern California, real rural country. 40 acres of old orchard land, apricots, almonds, a few walnut trees, too stubborn to die even in bad drought years. My grandfather started planting there in the 70s, and from the road it all looks peaceful. It isn't. It's a machine. Pumps, valves, pressure lines, buried pipe, every part, leaning on the next part to do its job. And up on the highest corner of the property sat the water tower. It was ugly, sure. Rust-red steel legs, old round tank faded ladder bolted to the side. Nobody was pulling over to admire it. But that tower mattered. It held reserve water, stabilized pressure, and kept the pumps from cooking themselves when July got hot and the orchard started drinking hard. Take it out and the whole place got jumpy. Pressure spiked, pipes strained, valves started acting like they had personal issues. Before I left for a 3-week consulting job in Portugal, I walked the property, checked the pumps, checked the tower gauge, made sure everything looked steady. I even looked over my permit file because that tower had been there long before the subdivision behind my orchard showed up. Then the developers arrived, and you know the type. Nice signs, soft colors, words like estates and preserve, as if paving over farmland becomes charming if the font is expensive enough. They built 200 houses behind my land, and ever since they started creeping toward my boundary, things had been tense. Survey flags appearing in odd places. Construction trucks wandering too close to my access road. One foreman even knocked on my door and asked if I'd consider moving the tower because it was visually inconsistent with the community aesthetic. I remember leaning on the doorframe thinking, you people built 200 identical beige houses and my rusty farm tower is the thing ruining the view. I told him no. Politely too, which now feels generous. A few weeks later, I'm in Lisbon, my phone buzzes, and it's Carl from the vineyard next door. Carl is not a man who texts for fun. If Carl sends a message, something is wrong. The hotel Wi-Fi was awful, so the picture loaded in slow, ugly pieces. First dirt, then tire tracks, then twisted metal, then temporary fencing. Under it, Carl wrote, "Hey, wasn't there supposed to be a tower here?" For about 10 seconds, my brain just locked up, because there were only two options. Either the tower had somehow fallen on its own or somebody had taken it down on purpose. So I started making calls from 6,000 miles away. County office first. No demolition permit. Local inspector next. No violation, no safety order, nothing. That narrowed things pretty fast. I emailed the developer's site office, and a few hours later some operations manager named Mark sent me one of those tidy little emails people write when they think confidence is the same thing as permission. 4 sentences. The structure had been removed due to safety concerns and possible interference with a construction access easement they intended to widen during grading. No apology, no warning, no documents. An easement is not ownership. It's a narrow right for a narrow purpose. It does not mean you get to tear down a permanent structure sitting outside the line just because your machinery wants more elbow room. My tower had always stood inside my property boundary, several feet inside. Still, I asked Mark for whatever map he thought made this okay. He sent me a revised site plan filed years after my original plat showing a widened corridor cutting way too close to the corner where my tower used to stand. But a shiny new map doesn't rewrite a deed. At first I was furious. Anybody would be. Something that had stood on my family's land for decades had been reduced to scrap while I was overseas. But once the shock burned off, the whole thing started to look simple. They hadn't removed the tower because it was unsafe. They removed it because it was inconvenient. And they'd done it while I was out of the country because they were betting distance would buy them time. That part almost impressed me. Almost. Instead of booking the next flight home and storming around like a fool, I opened my laptop and made a list. First call was Daniel Reyes, a licensed surveyor I'd used before. Quiet guy, careful guy. I told him what happened, sent the photo, and he went quiet for a second before he said, "Do you want the fast answer or the documented answer?" I told him I wanted the one a judge could read. Second call was Laura Chan, a civil engineer who specialized in agricultural water systems. I asked her one question: if somebody destroys a load-bearing irrigation tower built decades ago, what does replacement look like under current code? She said more expensive than they're hoping. 2 days later, Daniel was out there with a GPS rig tying every boundary marker back to the county record. No guessing off fences, no eyeballing. Laura reviewed the irrigation system. The load needs the reconstruction standards. Their reports hit my inbox within days, and that was when the mood in my hotel room got a whole lot better. Daniel confirmed the tower had stood roughly 6 feet inside my property line. Not on the easement, not brushing it, 6 feet inside. He also documented heavy equipment tracks cutting across the corner of my property beyond the corridor the developer claimed they were using. Machines don't lie. They leave prints. Then Laura sent her estimate, and I actually laughed out loud. Steel prices were up. Labor costs were up. Wind load requirements had changed since the 70s. That meant they couldn't replace my old tower with some cheap copy and call it even. If they were going to make me whole, they'd have to fund a new tower built to modern code, stronger, safer, and a lot more expensive than the one they knocked down. Sometimes karma wears a hard hat. Once I had those reports, I hired a local attorney named Marcus Holloway. Calm man, very precise. We put together a formal demand package with the survey, the photos, Laura's engineering estimate, and claims for trespass, property destruction, and orchard damage from the irrigation disruption. Then Marcus sent it not just to the developer, but to their insurance carrier too. A few days later, the insurance adjuster started pulling crew logs and equipment records from that grading area. Buried in those logs was one line that changed everything. The subcontractor operating the demolition equipment had been given a work instruction that said clear vertical obstructions in grading corridor. That was it. No ownership check. No boundary verification. No note that the structure might belong to the neighboring parcel. Just clear the obstacles. So the crew hadn't made some careful legal decision. They'd just flattened whatever stood in front of them because somebody higher up assumed the paperwork would catch up later. And once that line surfaced, the whole thing snapped into focus. This wasn't some murky dispute. It was trespass carried out by heavy equipment, then wrapped afterward in official-sounding nonsense. 10 days after Marcus sent the package, the insurance carrier agreed to fund the full reconstruction amount in escrow. Full amount. No drawn-out courtroom drama. Just money set aside to rebuild the tower exactly the way Laura specified, plus compensation for the crop stress caused while the system had been running without it. By the time my contract ended and I flew back to California, the place looked nothing like Carl's photo. The temporary fence was gone. In its place sat a fresh concrete foundation with anchor bolts sticking up like steel teeth. Nearby, a reconstruction crew was assembling the new tower. Bright galvanized steel, thicker supports, cleaner welds, slightly taller than the original, and able to hold more water. Laura had even added digital pressure sensors tied to my phone, so now I could check system pressure without climbing the ladder. Daniel had installed permanent brass boundary markers in concrete around that corner of the property. Bright, clean, impossible to miss. Anybody walking near that spot now could see exactly where my line stood. No confusion, just law set in the dirt. And the developer. Their crews quietly rerouted the access road. The new path curved a little farther away from my corner than their original plan. Nobody came back to my porch to talk about visual consistency. Funny how that works. They thought my absence meant weakness. Instead, it bought them a bigger invoice, a stronger tower, and a permanent reminder that property lines are not suggestions. People always ask if I was furious. Yeah, at first. But after the first wave passed, what really stuck with me was how ordinary the whole thing probably felt to them. Just pressure schedules, ego, and one ugly assumption that the landowner either wouldn't notice, wouldn't fight, or wouldn't know how. That's the part you have to watch for. A lot of these fights aren't won by the loudest person in the room. They're won by the calmest one with the best paperwork. Big trucks, official language, all of that can make you second-guess yourself. But authority without documentation is just noise. That's what this taught me. A deed matters. A survey matters. A stamped engineering report matters. If you slow down, gather facts, and put the right people on the problem, the whole balance shifts. The funny part is the end result actually improved my farm. The new tower is stronger. The irrigation system runs better. I can monitor pressure from my phone. Even those brass markers will probably prevent the next bright idea before it starts. So now when I stand out there in the evening and hear the pumps humming smooth again, and I look up at that taller tower catching the last bit of sun, I feel something better than anger. Not even revenge, really. Just that quiet, satisfying feeling you get when somebody tries to erase your line and ends up paying to make it brighter. So let me ask you this. If you came home and found a company had torn down part of your property without permission, what would your first move be? Would you march over there and confront them? Or would you start with documents, surveys, and evidence the way I did? Tell me where you think the line is between justice and payback. And if you've ever had somebody mistake your silence for surrender, I'd love to hear that story too.